Welcome everybody, and we'll just allow a few more moments for others to come into the space. So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. This is a wonderful global gathering. My name is Jennifer Nadel, and I'm the chair of the Global Compassion Coalition. And it is so wonderful to have you all here. Do pop a note in the chat and let us know where you're from. It's wonderful to see people joining us from all over the world. And we're so delighted that Margaret Cullen has joined us today to share with us a practice on equanimity. I'm sure that most of you know of Margaret's incredible work, but for those who don't, I'm just going to tell you a bit about her. Margaret Cullen is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a certified mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher. She was one of the first 10 instructors to be certified by the Center for Mindfulness. For over 40 years, she has been pioneering mindfulness-based programs in healthcare, education, business, and academic settings. She introduced mindfulness-based stress reduction to the cancer support community in both Santa Monica and Walnut Creek, California. 30 years later, they are still going strong. It's thriving. In 2009, she was invited to help develop compassion cultivation training at Stanford, where she went on to train teachers from all over the world. She's led research programs with universities across America and taught many different groups of people, from men with HIV to doctors to teachers. You name it, she's trained them. She has an incredible wealth of experience. She's co-authored a book on mindfulness-based emotional balance and is currently writing a book on equanimity, which is very fitting given today's topic. And I will now hand over to Margaret for the next 50 minutes or so.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Thank you, Christine, for your help in setting this up, and for all of you who made the time to be here live. This was going to be a webinar, but I know a number of you are teachers and can appreciate that connecting with you and seeing some of you makes a big difference for me, rather than just speaking to a camera. So I'm really grateful for those of you who are here. And I just want to do a very quick poll that Christine set up for us, for me to get a sense. I know a few of you, but not everybody, of what your background is. So we're going to, Christine is going to put a poll up with very quick answers, yes, no, or sort of, so I can get a little sense of your background, specifically with equanimity. So let's, so I can answer this. Also, it comes up to me. Okay. And I'll submit. And I can't see the answers. Christine, can you?
I sure can. I'm happy to share.
Okay.
It looks like we have, for the first question, majority yes, and that's the are you a meditation practitioner?
Okay.
Or have you done an equanimity practice? It's about 50-50.
50-50.
And
okay.
Is the concept of equanimity clear to you? Sort of is the highest answer.
I love that. Perfect. Okay, great. You know, I'm really excited about equanimity, and it's a bit of an oxymoron because equanimity doesn't seem exciting particularly. And I would say of the four immeasurables in Buddhism, it's really the least sexy one. It's not very sexy. It's not very exciting. And it also tends to be the most vague, which is why I put that sort of answer as an option up there. So that's perfect that that's kind of mainly where you all are in terms of equanimity. I think that's where a lot of people are around equanimity. So my plan, I have about 50 minutes or so, and I plan to use all of those minutes and divide them more or less equally between talking about equanimity, practicing equanimity, and then discussing it, the Q&A with those of you who are here. That's the plan. And in the talk about equanimity, I'm not going to have a lot of time. So I'm going to focus on what it is, what it isn't, and specifically how it relates to compassion, because that's what brings us all here in the Global Compassion Coalition. So I am going to use slides for my talk, but I winnowed them down. Hopefully I winnowed them down sufficiently. We'll see. And let me know if that screen share is working for everybody. Is that
Yep,
good?
looks great. Looks great,
Okay.
Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just gonna move my things around here a little bit. Okay, great. So we'll start, with this word that actually is a funny word. It's not a word that we use in normal speech that much. He wasn't very equanimous, or I need to cultivate more equanimity. It sounds a little pretentious, I think, a little contrived. It doesn't just like slip off the tongue in normal conversation. One of many reasons why equanimity has kind of gotten short shrift. It's not sexy, it's not exciting, except to me, and maybe you'll get a little more excited about it today. I hope so. And it's a little, I don't know, pretentious sounding. So let's look at it. What is equanimity? So generally speaking, it's a mental state or trait. And the only difference, of course, between a state or a trait is time. Trait is enduring, state is passing, temporal, and it's characterized by non-reactivity and clear seeing. No? And in Buddhism, where it's really very highly articulated, and in my research, I think it's the most highly articulated of all the traditions in Buddhism. It's the last of the four immeasurables. They're also called the heavenly or divine abodes. And mostly we talk about the first two, which are loving kindness. And of course, the second is compassion. And the third is sympathetic joy. They do come in order. The last is equanimity. And the first three, part of why equanimity isn't as sexy as the first three are kind of juicy. They feel good. Even compassion, I'm going to talk about this more. Even compassion, although it's related to suffering, it feels good. So for that reason, I tend to think of equanimity, the fourth of the immeasurables, as the quiet virtue. It can be found in all the major religions and in philosophical systems like Stoicism. It plays an interesting role. We don't have time to get into that here, but it isn't just a virtue in Buddhism. It's a virtue in all the traditions. So how does it function? There are different functions of equanimity. The most common function is to see the big picture with impartiality. That's what we think of when we think of the four immeasurables and equanimity in that context. One metaphor that I think is really beautiful and helpful for equanimity that's often comes up in Theravadan Buddhism is to see with grandmother eyes. It's a perfect metaphor in a lot of ways because grandmothers, it's almost a trope how much grandmothers love their grandchildren. But at the same time, they're less likely to be caught up in the drama of their grandchildren's lives. That's equanimity. It doesn't forsake love, but it sees with, we could say, with wisdom. It's love plus insight and wisdom. Yeah, holding hands here. That's a really good way to think about equanimity, grandmother's eyes. So this word that's a bit pretentious comes from the Latin. And I think what's helpful about looking at the Latin roots is that there are two words, and both words are important roots for equanimity. The first is equus, which means balance, but the second is animus, which means spirit, or fundamentally that which animates. That's not typically how we think about equanimity when we think about, still, chill, calm, cool. So the Latin root has animus in it, animation, aliveness. This shows that equanimity at its very core is dynamic. And I would even go so far as to say that stasis is a near enemy of balance, the kind of balance that's in equanimity. And this is a subtle, but I think really important point. I'm going to talk about near enemies more. It's a beautiful concept from Buddhism where something kind of masquerades as something and we get confused and we think we're doing that thing, but it's really something else. So static is a near enemy of balance. And if you look at, this is kind of small print here, so you may not be able to read the definition from Merriam-Webster, but stasis actually results in stagnation. Yeah, so that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something dynamic when we talk about equanimity, and that's key. The first language of the Buddha is Pali, and there are actually two words from Pali that are typically translated for equanimity. The first, most common one, and the easiest to pronounce, is upekkha. This is the word we typically hear when we hear the Pali words for the four immeasurables. And upekkha in Pali means to see clearly with impartiality, right? Neither moving towards pleasant, away from unpleasant. And it's also what allows us to extend love and compassion beyond our inner circle. And I'm sure most of you have done some form of loving kindness or compassion practice where you send the love and compassion out, first to loved ones, then to neutral people, then to challenging people, then to the whole world. That's the impartiality. That is equanimity, actually. That is a practice of equanimity that is combined with compassion or loving kindness. Yeah, that's the equanimity element. And that's the one that we tend to be most familiar with when we talk about equanimity. So here's a quote from Alan Wallace, a Buddhist teacher, scholar that I worked with a number of years ago, who wrote quite a bit about the four immeasurables. And Alan wrote, "It's equanimity that makes the other three immeasurables immeasurable. It infuses them with the vastness and impartiality that extends beyond our loved ones to strangers, to those who challenge us, and to all beings." In my reading and writing about equanimity, I found that haiku, more than any other form of writing, capture the essence of equanimity in their simplicity and in their quietness. So this one by Isa, under the cherry blossoms, none are utter strangers. Okay. So Upekkha can give us the sense, perhaps, that, in fact, I'll just go back here, that we're looking at the world from a distance, that we're detached, right? That, like this woman up on the hill, looking out over the landscape, but not really connected with it. And that is a misunderstanding. And it's interesting to look at this other word that's nearly impossible to pronounce. That's another translation for equanimity, which is tadramajatata. Maybe that's why you never hear it. Tadramatata. I'm not even sure that's the right way to pronounce it, frankly. But I do know that what it means is to stand in the middle, the opposite of detachment. Instead, equanimity actually requires us to be right up close with experience, not detached, standing wholly in the middle of life, all of it. So this is part of what gets me excited, is that I feel like we don't have the full picture of what equanimity is. We kind of ignore it. We think of it as detachment. We don't look at this second important definition from the Pali or word. And I actually think I chose a gyroscope for Tatramajatata and this other way of viewing equanimity, because it's a very good metaphor for a dynamic kind of balance that I think really captures more the heart of what equanimity is. And you notice that the gyroscope has this long vertical axis and a spinning center wheel. Here, we're actually going to watch it go. And these two things allow the gyroscope to move with every external force without getting knocked over and without losing course. This is really cool, right? This is how ships navigate and planes navigate. And in terms of equanimity, we see the course, we see the true course, and we maintain a dynamic kind of balance. Yeah. So yeah, okay. The things that challenge our equanimity are, I think, beautifully captured by another Buddhist concept, which is called the 8 worldly concerns. You know, in Buddhism, there are lots of lists with different numbers of things. And these are the forces that challenge our equanimity: gain and loss, pleasure and pain, praise and blame, fame and disrepute. And you might even notice, just by naming them and seeing their universality and the reality that they're constantly coming and going, can even create a little bit of equanimity, a little bit of room to not take them so personally, to not get attached to them. And of course, you know, I put the Facebook likes, even though it's not Facebook anymore. You know, that's already out of dated. But we do live in a world of social media where our equanimity is constantly being challenged by that kind of feedback, that where we need the gyroscope to keep us on course, to titrate constantly, to pull back and see the reality. And I'll just say very quickly that in relation to the 8 worldly concerns is where most of the other major traditions explore equanimity as well, although they don't call it that. So it's important to think about the near enemy of equanimity, this beautiful concept of what masquerades as equanimity, where we get confused. And the near enemy is indifference. we might say apathy or passivity or detachment. Sometimes we can think we're being equanimous when we're really checking out in some way. There's like, I'm just chill, everything's cool, but it's really not caring. And that is not equanimity. Not only does it mean we care, it doesn't even mean we care less. The grandmother doesn't love less. She has more wisdom, but not less love, right? So, I would even venture to say, and I'm not going to be able to share with you all of the research that I've collected around this, but I would venture to say that with equanimity, we actually feel more rather than less. We just have more resilience. We come back, we're able to work with our inner gyroscope so that we're able to come back to course and see clearly. And for this, I love this quote from Matthew Brensilver, a meditation teacher, who says, equanimity actually, it deepens the poignancy of our lives. We don't feel less, we're more touched, but it drains our lives of melodrama. To me, that's a subtle and really perfect distinction between the two. So now, how does it relate to compassion? And here from another teacher of mine, Joseph Goldstein, equanimity offers a great gift to compassion in that it allows us to respond to the heart that is moved by compassion with balance and wisdom, which is kind of saying the same thing, right? So, let's see, I just lost my place for a minute here on the slides. Okay, so I want to review compassion. People have different definitions of it. I'm going to share one way of thinking about compassion. Like emotions, these are things we don't all agree on, which is kind of interesting. There are a lot of different theoretical models for compassion. So most of us agree that it's multimodal. There are many components of compassion. The first is an awareness of suffering. There really is no compassion without suffering. It is a response to suffering. Then we could say there's a feeling of being emotionally moved by the suffering. You could argue that, and this is really empathy, that empathy can be cognitive as well as affective. Sometimes there's compassion with just cognitive empathy, but usually there's affective empathy that precedes compassion. And then what moves us a little bit out of empathy is a desire to see that suffering relieved. And then related, but if we want to begin to get more granular, in addition to the desire, there's a willingness to help relieve that suffering whenever possible. Yeah. And finally, a part that I want to unpack around equanimity that I think is really interesting is that compassion often results in a warm glow or a sense of satisfaction. So what is this warm glow? A lot of people have looked at it. These images are related to the research of Jamil Zaki at Stanford, who's looked a lot at pro-social behavior, at empathy, at compassion. And Zaki says that he has brain imaging data that shows that being kind to others registers in the brain more like eating chocolate, actually, which is pretty fun, than fulfilling an obligation, which is more like eating Brussels sprouts, unless you love Brussels sprouts. And there's a lot of other research, and again, we don't have time, but Tanya Singer's lab did fascinating research about the different parts of the brain that light up with compassion as opposed to empathy. There's a lot of research that shows that when we get to compassion, when we engage the motivation to be pro-social, whether or not we're able to act on it in the world, it actually feels good. It feels good. So we'll pause for a warm glow. This is non-human, but we feel that warm glow, even witnessing compassion, right? It doesn't have to be generated inside. Well, what inhibits the warm glow? You're aware of suffering, you feel moved, you want to help, but you can't because maybe you don't have the resources. Maybe the person won't accept your help. Aha, now we get into the equanimity. Maybe you become overwhelmed by your own suffering. This happens a lot. You start out with the suffering of the other person. It reminds you of your own grief, your own loss. You become overwhelmed. It precludes, it eclipses the warm glow. Maybe you're afraid and you shut down. Yeah. Maybe you try to get chill, you back off, you, instead of equanimity, you move into indifference. Yeah. Maybe you believe, I can't make a difference, why bother? Which is a form of pseudo-inefficacy. And this results in compassion collapse, a very interesting phenomenon that Daryl Cameron and his colleagues have studied. It's a really interesting study, research you may have heard of, where he kind of demonstrated that people feel more compassion for an image of one starving child in Darfur than hundreds of starving children in Darfur. You may get a sense of how that feels, but intellectually it doesn't make sense, really. We should care more, I think, about hundreds of starving children. But what he found out, and this is key, I think, to equanimity and what we're talking about here, is that what gets in the way, what causes compassion to collapse, is actually emotion regulation. What we think of as a good thing, I'm an emotion regulator, I can regulate my emotions, actually not so good, not so good. What's better is emotion tolerance. I can manage my emotions. I am willing to feel the pain of the world. I am willing to be moved by the poignancy of the world. And he found this in several different studies, both in people who were naturally good at emotion regulation, which I would say in this sense means a little bit more suppression than what we sometimes think of as regulation. And even in people who were primed to regulate their emotions before they looked at the images. So they were instructed, just don't react. There was more compassion collapse with them. This is a little bit paradoxical, isn't it? That compassion collapses when you feel less. You know, it doesn't protect you to feel less. It doesn't work, actually. And there's other really interesting research. I'm talking longer than I intended to anyway, from Richie Davidson's lab about how adept meditators actually feel more. There's more reaction in the brain, not less. This isn't about feeling less. It's increasing your capacity to feel more. Okay, so you see, I get excited about this. So how does cultivating equanimity mitigate against compassion collapse? Well, it widens our perspective. It promotes clear seeing. You know, it mitigates against pseudo-inefficacy. We're not attached to outcome. Like, oh, I give up. I can't help, so forget it. I'm just getting myself out of the game. This is really key with equanimity. I have no control over the outcome, but I'm never giving up. Very different approach, yeah? It promotes impartiality, so we don't draw a line and say, only my loved ones get my compassion. It definitely increases our tolerance of suffering, of emotion, of being moved, of the suffering of ourselves and others. And again, it facilitates skillful action. Like, what can I do rather than giving up? What can I do? I can't solve the situation in Darfur. What can I do? So before we do a practice together, just a couple of words of caution, always. So equanimity is not a shortcut. We can't like go to equanimity in order to avoid or do a spiritual bypass around our feelings. We don't avoid feelings. We can't inflict perspective taking on ourselves and others. Just see the big picture. Or your mother saying, you know how many children are starving, and it doesn't work. You know, that just doesn't work. You can't inflict that on anybody. I also like, one of my teachers, important teachers, was Marshall Rosenberg, who used to say, empathy before education. You know, before we take perspective and take stock, we need empathy for ourselves and others. And I would say empathy before equanimity. Okay. So I'm going to stop the share there, and there will be time for questions after. We're going to go right into a practice, and I would like to suggest that you maybe just take a stretch first, maybe a little shake, and kind of shake out this more conceptual approach to equanimity before we get into a practice, a brief guided practice of equanimity. So yes, feel free to turn off your cameras if you want. But see if you can stay with me. See if you can find a posture now that's upright. It's different time of day for a lot of us. So find a posture that brings both uprightness and also comfort. And taking a couple of diaphragmatic breaths. Letting the whole torso fill with the in-breath. And emptying the torso completely of the breath on the out-breath. And after the third out-breath, releasing control of the breath, let it flow naturally, letting your eyes close or your gaze be soft and lowered, whatever's more comfortable for you. And taking a few minutes now to follow the natural sensations of the breath wherever they're most predominant in your body. As best you can, bringing an attitude of kindness, patience, even amusement to the wandering mind. It's inevitable, so why fight it? And the less you fight it, the less agitated it will be. And if you're able to stay with the sensations of the breath and the body for a breath or two, see if you can notice the space between the breaths. That moment of equipoise that happens all by itself. And let this become the focus of your attention. The effortless, spacious ease between expansion and contraction, between rising and falling, in and out. Now taking a moment to meet whatever is arising in the present moment with a kind and clear awareness. This is an aspect of mindfulness that overlaps with equanimity. Noticing the changing nature of experience, thoughts coming and going, feelings, sensations. Reflecting on how all created things arise and pass away. It's their nature. Joys and sorrows, people, buildings, experiences that are pleasant, that are unpleasant. Political reigns, leaders come and go, nations, even civilizations. Sensing into your own inner gyroscope amidst all that is constantly changing. The axis that you titrate towards your own true north. And experiment with silently repeating these phrases. Things are just as they are. All things are impermanent. Feelings arise and pass away. I'm safe in this moment. Noticing the implications for your current preoccupations. Things are as they are. All things are impermanent. Now, bringing to mind a recent interaction that might have upset you in some way, a disagreement, a misunderstanding, and choosing something of mild to moderate intensity, not overwhelming, not a really big thing. Something that feels manageable. And feel what arises in your heart and mind as you recall this incident. Sadness, maybe, confusion, anger. Now let's just try on, just as an experiment, perspective taking, to see what's possible in this moment. Let's say that you're an astronaut looking at the situation from outer space. You might recall the famous words of Carl Sagan, the American astronomer who wrote about the blue dot we call home, a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam, where everyone you know, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. So from this perspective, more the upeka flavor of equanimity, what do you see? How does the situation look to you? And just to remind you, don't inflict this perspective. If there's resistance, stay with the emotion and meet it with tenderness, and just drop the perspective. It's an experiment, an exploration. And coming back to the breath. Letting go of the reflection. And now, take a moment for another reflection, considering how much of our own happiness or suffering is more a result of our own thoughts and actions and circumstances than what others wish for us. We all have people who love us, friends, parents, partners, children, but ultimately, we are responsible for our own happiness and well-being. This is also true for our loved ones. Loving others inevitably opens us to feelings of helplessness when our loved ones suffer. No matter how fortunate their lives, there will be periods of pain for everyone we love. We can love them, but in the end, their happiness and suffering depend more on their own thoughts, actions, and circumstances than our wishes for them. So recognizing this reality without forsaking any love at all, recalling a loved one who's going through some difficulty, and feeling into this phrase. Your happiness and your suffering depend more on your thoughts and actions and circumstances than my wishes for you. Recognizing this, I will continue to wish for your happiness and hope that you find the deepest source of that happiness. I will care for you, but I cannot protect you from suffering. May you find balance and peace. And expanding these wishes as we close. May we bring compassion and equanimity to the events of this world. May we keep our hearts and minds open to life, to the poignancy of this life, and to one another, so that we may see the deepest possible truth and respond with wisdom. And may our practice together be of benefit to all beings everywhere without exception. And whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes. thank you for your attention and your practice through a little bit longer than I intended. I thought I had my timing a wee bit better, but there still is time for questions and comments, and I'm very open and interested in any reactions at all that you want to share or questions that you have.
Margaret, I'll just jump in and say thank you. That was an incredibly beautiful practice, and I loved everything you said about equanimity, about how it was in the center of everything, not in that detached place of non-feeling. And I also wondered about the role of denial, of people just not actually knowing what they're feeling. You talked about indifference, but what kind of a role does denial play in inhibiting the compassionate process?
I don't know about data about denial, but I can certainly speak from my own experience. And I do actually know, I can't cite it specifically, but there's a lot of data around the importance of interoception and emotional intelligence. So I think we can extrapolate with confidence and certainly intuitively say that denial is the enemy of equanimity and compassion and would feed compassion collapse. And there's so much interesting research now on the importance of interoception, or really knowing what's going on in the body. And the body is the main place where we feel our feelings. And that's where we tend to get cut off from our feelings. You know, that's really where denial happens, is that classic quote of, you know, Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body, right? I'm over here. Denial is often happens through intellectualization, right? It's cutting off the body, which is the reservoir. We can learn a little through the mind, but it's mostly through the body. So yeah, I think of denial as a form of suppression. And, you know, it's often a habit. You know, we sometimes think of denial as a choice, when in fact, denial is often a habit that's learned from childhood, that's taught, you know, no, you don't feel that way. Or a family says, those feelings aren't okay. So then denial becomes something more of a habitual process than a choice, which is, I think, is very often the case, at great cost, you know, cost to our health, to our personal well-being, let alone our capacity to care for others.
And that feeds into a wider question about the extent to which the culture that we find ourselves in either amplifies or encourage, you know, or discourages equanimity and compassion.
It does. And, you know, another interesting distinction that came up with the Matthew Brensilver quote and my thinking about social media, especially, and the challenge of it, how much it challenges our equanimity, is that it feeds into melodrama. You know, and melodrama doesn't mean feeling more. And that's a really fun, fascinating, very subtle kind of teasing apart of what's the difference between the melodrama, the kind of overblown reaction, and the actual being moved by the heart, which is often a quieter, we might even say deeper emotional response. That melodrama kind of, what do I want to say, paradoxically moves us out of our feelings, right? I mean, we're feeling it, we're experiencing it, but it's almost more like a soap opera on TV, where we're getting kind of falsely hyped up, and we're in a very reactive mode rather than connecting with our deeper feelings. I'm not sure I fully have the language for it yet, but it's something I'm thinking a lot about these days. Thank you for the question. I don't know if the answer made sense.
No, it made complete sense. And it makes me think, obviously at the Global Compassion Coalition, we're interested in how do we alleviate compassion on a global scale. And it makes me think about the extent to which many of our nations are operating in a field of melodrama, and certainly our political space is operating in a field of melodrama. And of course, that involves our ego, and we have adrenaline feeding the system. And it makes me think of the Wizard of Oz, that, there are these huge flashes and bangs, but behind it all is just this tiny little person who's feeling maybe just something as simple as disappointment or sadness that they can't tolerate. And so instead, the soap opera is projected onto all of our lives.
Exactly. Thank you. That's exactly how it looks to me. That oddly, the soap opera is a protection against vulnerability. And vulnerability, from my perspective, is the feeling tone of equanimity. It is actually vulnerable. It is the willingness to experience life at its most tender without going into denial, reactivity, soap operas, melodramas, or the kind of ego, reactivity of the ego. It's staying with the vulnerability that is underneath all of that. It's very tender equanimity, actually.
That's such a beautiful description. And, at the beginning, you started your talk by saying it was the unsexy part of the process. But there's something so delicately beautiful about what you're describing that has more beauty to me than all the flashiness of compassion and loving kindness. Something so nuanced.
Yeah, they all fit together, of course. And, their Venn diagrams, they overlap like crazy, and they have lots of connections. And we tease them apart kind of as a way in. The same way there are all these different doorways into equanimity. There are all these different doorways into the heart, into this fundamental dimension of being that we all prize, that gets expressed through compassion, through loving kindness, through equanimity, through, celebrating the well-being of others. Yeah.
I love what you just said about doors. By the way, I'm asking questions because everyone else is allowing me to. If you want me to stop asking questions, you have to post your own question. Otherwise, I'm just enjoying myself.
I see that Dorothy has a question. She's raising her hand.
Oh, great. Dorothy, come right in.
It is really, Jennifer, I love the questions you've been asking, and I wanted to jump in and chime in on the unsexy comment. I actually have been most curious about equanimity, and it feels like the most elusive. And when I've asked teachers to help give me guidance on it, they've instructed me that the other doorways in were through the other divine abodes, which I could feel and sense, but it wasn't. It's so helpful to have the nuance and the subtleness named, both so I can see it in the other practices, and the image of the gyroscope is so helpful. So I really think that this is a key element, and I'm glad that you're shining a light on it in the way that you are. And I hope that this message can get elevated in the way that, loving kindness and compassion and joy. I feel like those are juicy and they're just more accessible. I think they're like the low-hanging fruit of the divine abodes, but I think it's equanimity that is the key to having this endure and bring about the change we want to see. I know in myself and in the world. So thank you, Jennifer, for letting me just jump in. I was getting really excited about your question. So thank you, Margaret. Really, really appreciate it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Dorothy.
You got excited about equanimity. Yay. That's wonderful. Yay,
and Tenzin looks as if she's raising her hand as well. Maybe you're excited too.
Yeah. Hey, Margaret, really great to see you. You know what you were saying about melodrama, and it reminded me of something my friend, Dr. Joey Weber, who developed this training called equanimity-based compassionate action. And he's really talking about how equanimity is like the bridge between mindfulness and compassion. And one thing he said really struck me, and he said, if we don't develop equanimity towards the neutral experiences in our life, we're just spending our life in the waiting room, waiting for that next dopamine hit of the Facebook like or the Instagram likes. And we're missing our whole life. Like if we can savor the neutral and savor the lack of melodrama, we get so addicted to the highs and lows. So what you were saying about that just reminded me of that, because it really struck me when he said, we're just living our life in the waiting room, just waiting for the next pleasant, if we don't develop equanimity towards the neutral. So I just wanted to kind of bring that in because it sort of was a great way of framing, I felt.
Oh, I agree. Thank you, Tenzin.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. That's a very helpful perspective. And not to mistake equanimity for the neutral.
Yeah, right. Right.
Equanimity to neutral experience. So it's all included. Yes.
Yeah. And thank you for making equanimity sexy, Margaret. I really appreciate it because I think about equanimity a lot these days too.
It's great to see you, Tenzin. I think we're almost out of time. I don't know, Jennifer, what you
We've
think.
got time for one more question. Does anyone else want to add anything to the conversation? I think we're all feeling too much equanimity. We don't need to leap into the ring. Margaret, that was so beautiful. I really can't thank you enough. And yes, thank you for raising the profile of equanimity. And I really look forward to your book. And you know, I know we'll all be eagerly reading it and sharing it and deepening our understanding. And just before we leave, I wanted to just take a moment to remind everyone that the Global Compassion Coalition is officially launching on April the 15th, which is a Saturday, and we're having a wonderful gathering from across the globe. It's called Compassion Now, and there'll be opportunities to learn how to cultivate compassion, connect with compassion researchers, practitioners, and activists, and become part of this movement to try and create a more compassionate world. We are the majority, and yet so often we feel voiceless and silence in the face of the noisy and clamoring edges. So please do join us. I think Claggy's going to put a little link in the calendar in the chat. And Margaret, thank you again. I found that deeply moving and inspiring. I'm so grateful to you for being with us and for your work.
Thank you so much.
Incredible work, but for those who
Sorry. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for sharing some of my excitement about equanimity.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for
Thank
being
you
here.
so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Margaret.
Thanks,
Thank
Margaret.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.